Tzoraim Tovim. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a real pleasure to open our discussion on the civic role of curators. It's a round table with Neil MacGregor. In many ways, this is a direct continuity with Neil's lecture from last night as part of the annual lecture series, Vita Activa, Vita Contemplativa. Neil gave a fascinating lecture, I think most of you were there, about the civic role of museums. And we thought that it would only be natural to continue that conversation with Neil by discussing the civic role of curators. Let me just say additional two words about today's event and more generally about the Leer Jerusalem Institute. Those who do not know me, I'm Shai Levi. I'm the director of the Institute. It's very special for us to have this crowd in this building. It's a combined group of people from the arts, curators and artists and people who are interested in the art world, and academics, many of whom have an interest in arts, don't we all, but who are here also for a workshop on the role of intellectuals in today's society and how to educate for aware, alert, or active citizenship. And so that's another context for this meeting. More generally, the Leer Jerusalem Institute is a research institute. It's an institute that is committed to this place, to a more open, democratic society. And with respect to the arts, we're planning some events and some projects for this year. So let me just briefly share with you one or two of our plans. We will begin in the spring a program for documentary filmmakers. It's an idea of an intellectual incubator for filmmakers here at the Institute. And we would also like to think of different ways to work with the plastic arts and different other art forms. And so we're also open to suggestions and collaborations and different ways of making the connection between the arts and, let's say, research and academia. So without further ado, let me just introduce to you the chair of the round table. Dr. Lubin is a curator and writer in the field of contemporary art. Currently, he is a curator of the Midrasha Gallery, Hayarko 19, and founding co-editor of Tohu magazine, a trilingual online art publication published in Hebrew, Arabic, and English. Lubin was recently named as a curator of Aya Ben Ron's exhibition for the Israeli Pavilion in the 58th Venice Biennale. And allow me to add that we are trying, the Leer Jerusalem Institute is trying in some ways also to be a small part of the project. I'm very proud about that. Avi, please.
I'll start by introducing the people around the table with me. First, we'll start with Sir Neil MacGregor, who is, I think, the guest of honor of these two last days. Sir MacGregor is a British art historian, the founding director of the Humboldt Forum in Berlin, and former director of the British Museum and the National Gallery in London. He's a former editor of Burlington magazine also. Next to him, Dr. Galia art director and curator of the Pyramid Contemporary Art Center in Haifa, and former director and curator of Mishkan Museum of Art in Harod. Professor Ido Bruno, sorry, this is my Professor Ido Bruno, the Anne and Jerome Fisher director of the Israel Museum. He's also a teacher at the Bezalel Academy for the last 25 years and professor at the Academy since 2014. He's a designer, curator, also designer of art exhibitions at the Israel Museum and other venues as well. Said Abu Shakra, next to me, is director and founder of El-Fahim Art Gallery. He's the initiator of the first Palestinian museum in Israel. And last but not least, Professor Dror Wahrman, a culture historian at the Hebrew University, and just completed his tenure as Dean of Humanities at the university. I wanted to conduct this panel as maybe more as a conversation, and to start with something that we heard last night in the lecture. I think it was maybe towards the end of the lecture that Mr. MacGregor said that he specifically discussed about the point of religion, but I think when we're thinking about the Israeli situation, or maybe also globally, questions like the occupation maybe, or like the situation of refugees is also relevant, but he argued that these questions, these burning questions, are something that sometimes the parliaments or the other institutions are refusing or not tending to discuss or conduct the important conversations, and that maybe the museums can serve and fill this blank or empty space. And I want to start with you, and then maybe with the other participants, is how museums fill this gap. Or
thank you very much. I was speaking, of course, from the rather particular positions of two museums, the one in London, the British Museum, and in Berlin, which have both been set up very much on the idea that a museum is as much about debate as about display. Both of them were conceived as places where the citizens could disagree without being disloyal. It's a very important starting point, I think, that in both cases the state funded a place where objects would be put on show in London and Berlin, and the purpose of that would be to allow the citizens to challenge the ideas of the state through the objects and to rethink their role as citizens of that place and of the world. It's, I think, a very powerful role that's become more important. And in a couple of examples, I think it's clear. I think most of us would agree that in the last 30, 40 years, one of the major changes in politics has been that more and more conflict is articulated in terms of religious identity. Whether that's actually the dynamic is a separate question, but it's articulated in those terms. And it has become, I think, essential to be able to discuss why religious identity is so significant. If we're going to address the problems caused politically, we need a place where we can address that. A museum like the one in London or Berlin can do this in the context of many objects over a long history. So the first thing I think that a museum can do is to locate the current problem in a different timescale, which is not a timescale that the press or journalists or politicians will usually address. And that's a critical thing. We put it in a different timescale. The second is to be a place where all citizens, all people who come on an equal footing, which is impossible if that is to be held in the building of one religion, even though one may be very welcome there. Nobody feels on an equal footing if they're in the religious building of a religion which is not their own tradition. And that's very important. And then the third is, of course, the ease of access and how you reach a wider public. Clearly, if you have a big space and free admission, you can reach a wide public. But I think one of the other dimensions of debate today has to be that the museum place for debate must be connected with the public outside. Live streaming now makes this completely possible. You can have literally global debates. They can be followed on tweet, on Facebook, whatever. You can actually look at the objects, discuss the objects, debate the objects, and have different views of the same object conducted in front of a limitless public. And I think that's the great opportunity. And there is no other space where this can happen. In London, at least, we know that one of the topics we wanted to address, for instance, was the question of what is happening in Iran. Big Iranian collections, big Iranian diaspora. from the different sides. Debates about that, discussion about in the university were broken up, had to be broken up by the police. The university turned into a place where debate led to violence. There is, I think, something about the museum space which almost forces a different discourse and certainly enables it. So I think the idea of opening it to a very wide public, but tying it to things which can be looked at differently and giving a different historic dimension is the one thing. I don't see any other place that can do that. Okay.
I have a continuing question, but I first wanted maybe any of the other participants want to say something about, from your experience or exhibitions, events, things that you did in your positions as directors and curators?
Well, in order to do so, in order to be able to discuss crucial issues of the time without violence or without, creating a debate, and in order for the museum to be a forum, maybe the last forum that is capable of doing that, the museum have to develop a complex, rich discourse. And if the museum is not capable of doing that, then the museum will not have the authority. You may say that the institution of a museum is posited in as a liminal space that actually allows, in times of crisis, what cannot be done in society, but it won't be enough.
Can I just respond to that, Chris? I think you're absolutely right. Of course, the key role then of the curator is to ensure that other voices, you've invited the right other voices. You've enabled the right people to participate. And I think it's maybe one of the great differences between a curator and a university scholar, that the curator has an obligation to allow and to foster, to invite absolutely contradictory views to be held at the same time. And who you invite, of course, determines the validity, the authenticity of the debate.
And not only that, it needs a repertoire, it needs a scale of time that you do it, that somehow encompass something. And then also you are dealing a lot with the history of ideas and with theory and how you articulate your work, objects, but also the activity on a ground which is a rich ground of a discourse, of a complex discourse. If the discourse is not complex enough and is not loaded by whatever context that the museum is in charge of loading it, then it doesn't work. So it's a big responsibility that has to be constantly worked on. And since everything is changing all the time, you cannot repeat the ideas or your convictions of 10 years ago because it doesn't work anymore.
Well, we want
use mic. Well, first, as the non-museum person here, who represents the university and the academics, I'm not 100% certain that the museum would be the only place. I would think of the university also as a safe space for this kind of exchange. But it is impressive for me that this is kind of the Jürgen Habermas vision of the public space is the museum, and I want to kind of reinforce that with the content of what museums hold, because the advantage that museums have is that they hold works of art or objects that are open to interpretations, and they're more open, or they yield themselves, they lend themselves to more different kinds of interpretations in ways that, say, our students often, or the public often find puzzling. But that gives the opportunity to actually, and you said this yesterday, it gives the opportunity to bring up different narratives, different interpretations, different ways of thinking through the objects, through the artworks that are not always possible in other contexts. And in that sense, I do think that whatever museums hold does give the space to do what you imagine. I would say this a little bit maybe as a provocation to my colleagues here, that my experience has been that curators are not always that keen on interpretation. That in fact, as you said, their particular job stops before that, and that the kind of interpretations that you can do in order to open up a real conversation may not always sit well with some of, at least, the curators I've met.
I want to throw...
I love the curators. Let there be no mistake. That's sort of...
We're about to throw rotten tomatoes.
Sorry?
We're about to throw rotten tomatoes.
You're in the right room for that remark. Maybe I want to throw into this a couple of maybe two more ideas or two more remarks. One has to do, you mentioned room for debate and room for display. And one of, I think, the major roles, I would say, of museums, especially in a society like the Israeli society, would actually be a meeting place. So even before the debate, one of the problems I see is that even on a timeline, if you look at the past 30 or 40 years, some of the communities in Israel or bordering Israel have less and less places to meet and actually just to get to know each other. So that is a major role of the museum, actually engaging people with art or with archaeology or with different aspects of culture, depending on the museum, but also a meeting place for different parts of society. That in itself is a major challenge, and it's becoming, in our society here, it's becoming more difficult over time. And the second thing I want to throw into this discussion is the question of what happens. There is a split, I think a growing split, between what's going on in the media and what's going on the ground. And there's this paradox that things that get exposed in the media can be detrimental to what's actually going on in the ground. I think a lot of museum people will tell you that what's actually happening in the museum is slightly different than what is exposed, and will it be exposed? It will damage what's going on. So I see some of the people in the audience here. I think they can add to that. So there's a dilemma. Yes, it means that there's more engagement and more things going on in actual reality. But if you expose them, they will stop happening. Okay?
Why?
Specifically, why? Because the communities, I'll mention a few examples, okay? That we have a large community of Arab Israelis living on the eastern part of Jerusalem. Some of them come to the museum. If we publish the fact that they come to the museum, especially for the specific reasons they come to the museum, they will stop coming, or they won't be able to come because their communities will prevent that from them, okay? We have similar issues with people from the extreme Orthodox communities, okay? It's not a black and white thing. There's different shades of gray to that, but it is a meaningful thing. And we have to decide whether we want to publicize things and create maybe a wider effect in the media, or we actually want that particular activity to continue going on. And I'd be happy to hear from the audience as well if people can experience that in other places or from the panel.
Yeah, so I have to say that your answers opened up a lot of questions, but I'll start with maybe two, a bit more simple. One of them, I think you talk about wide publics and a variety of people, but I don't know, you talked yesterday about 7 million visitors to the British Museum every year, and I guess that the Israel Museum has many visitors as well, and other museums too, but I think a lot of parts of the population are not coming to the museum, not only because of reasons like because of political, in the sense of Israelis and Palestinians, or religious, but also even the small fact that it costs a lot of money to enter the museum, or another thing that many times the museum seems very detached from the street. So it's a question about how a museum can be this public space if all these communities are not coming to be part of the discussion. And the second question is about, you mentioned, I think both of you, that a museum can be a place for different views, maybe contradicting views sometimes. And my question is if the museum is not supposed from time to time to take a stand, not to be only a platform for different views, but to be very direct and say something. And I'm asking that, especially because I think, for example, in the Israeli situation, you see for many times, many times you see, for example, professors in the university or actors or filmmakers that are taking a stand, but it's hardly that you see museum directors or curators taking a public stand about a political question. So I'm asking if a museum should be only a platform to bring the contradicting views, or should say something also. And it's an open question.
Well, do you want one of us to respond? Okay. So the museum is not for bringing the contradiction, but the museum is a forum for discussing and for a complex discourse, I would say. But the fact that I'll start in a different way. I think that the real problem is what was said yesterday at the end of the lecture. The problem is how actually we do the things that we like to do and make sense to people outside the museum, while we understand that most of people do not visit the museum. And most of the nice, correct, proper things that you would like me to say in the museum will not at all make sense to most of people who wouldn't even visit the museum, not mentioning participating in the discourse in the museum. And so the practices, yesterday we were presented with one way of making sense to people through objects, taking from the collection an object, disregarded for many, many years, and then through practices of research and contemplation, seeing it in different ways that are relevant for the time, and by that actually taking a stand.
Thank you. I think it's an extraordinarily difficult question, I think, for a public institution to take a political position. And I think the starting point would be that it shouldn't. But I think there are, it's possible, two examples which I'd quite like to know what other people judge that came up with the British Museum. The first is in relation to to Africa and the economic injustices in relation to Africa, where it seemed that clearly is a political position, whether the Western countries, the rich countries, should write off debt relief to Africa, whatever, whether that should be something that the museum allows itself to be a platform for and to support a campaign for. And the trustees, we're lucky that we have trustees who are there to defend us against government, but also to say what the place should be about. Therefore, that was one of the fundamental values of the place, of the institution, to talk about global justice in that sense. And so the museum, in this area that's not directly related to it, took a position. Much more directly was the question of loans to relations with Tehran. Relations with Tehran about 5-6 years ago. The museum had put on an exhibition in London of Iranian history, an attempt to explain to the public and to allow citizens in Britain to understand how Iranians see themselves in the world. Not something we learn at school, not something that's taught, insofar as we learn at all about Iran at school, it's through the ancient Greeks as the barbarian others and the enemies. No idea of what it might be like from the other side. That was quite a strong statement. Relations were extremely bad. And it turned out to have, I think, a very real impact it led to greater press discussion about Iran's history, Iran's view of itself, and of its role in the Middle East, and in particular of the role of Cyrus and Iran in relation to Jewish history. In response, the Iranians asked if we would lend back the Cyrus cylinder to Tehran. It was at a moment when Europe and the United States had imposed sanctions on Iran. And it was very much not government policy to do anything that could possibly be seen as supporting the regime in Tehran. An absolutely existential problem, I think, for trustees. The notion of the museums as being part of a republic of letters, a community of scholarship, of research, of investigation, where you held these objects for everybody, really making a proper, giving sense to the idea of trusteeship. These are not held for the British public, they're held for everybody. That includes the Iranians. There is a community of a republic of letters. And in the face of formal requests from the State Department in Washington not to lend, nothing was said by the British government because it knew the trustees were independent, but we knew it was against the wishes of the government. The trustees lent to Tehran. Now, you could read that as endorsing a regime, or you could see it as enabling in Tehran a quite different kind of discussion, which in fact it did. What we didn't expect, but what happened when it was there, this great emblem of Cyrus and of the values of Iran, was that it led to a very heated debate, very violent debate, violent almost in the physical sense, about whether Iranian values necessarily were Islamic ones. Cyrus being, of course, pre-Islamic, but admirable, clearly, and Iranian. And in a way that we had not expected, it turned out to be a very, very complex discussion, and in no sense an endorsement of the regime, and used in a way we hadn't expected by people who had different views of what Iran was and ought to be. So it was a stand, and I think it's the sort you're talking about, it was a very political stand, but I think we all felt comfortable that it was a stand that was proper for a museum to take. It would not be proper for us to take a stand on the nationalization of the railways or something of that sort. But this is an area, and I think those areas, museums, while still being a forum for bigger, it is essential that they take those stands and insist that communication, dialogue continues below the political radar.
Yeah,
but
I was thinking about I think a few years ago, there was a story when Trump was elected, and he did all this for immigrants, all these rules not to allow them to enter, and then MoMA decided to hang paintings of people that cannot enter the US. And I was thinking, for example, in Israel, when there was all this discussion about the loyalty law, why did the museum not take out works that are not allowed under loyalty law, for example, or show works from their collections that...
in Haifa.
In Haifa, where?
Yeah, in Haifa a week ago, an exhibition 1948 was opened with different narratives about the war of 1948. I mean, they planned it long before, but the risk was there, and they were carrying on with also the municipality backing them. And when just before they did it, me and other places, because I'm now running a place in Haifa, we told them that if there'll be any whatever, then we will all put works dealing with 1948 in different ways. So, and we all agreed, I mean, all the institutions in Haifa to do that. So it means that something is happening, but I think that just manifestations, you know, being on the right side does not help, and sometimes also brings up, I mean, helps forces that we wouldn't like to give them weapon and help them with their whatever Merkaz al-Likud.
I would love to apologize for that I am the only one who is not doctor, and the only one who is not professor. For that, my English it's very bad. But
Arabic is much better than the
yeah. But I will speak with sometimes with English, and sometimes I need translation. I would love to remind that I come from al-Fahim, and I come with the first experience to build the first Arab museum, the first Palestinian museum inside Israel. For that, it's not only museum. It's museum that all the questions that we speak here about them inside and included in inside the museum. It's the first experience, and the curator there have to be more than a curator. He has to be the vision with the future and the identity of the Palestinian art in Israel. He has to work and to collect all the things around. The awareness, the love, the touch with the people, with art, and another things he has to work with the collection and to work with the design of the Palestinian identity of culture inside the museum. For that, it's more than curator. And the museum, it's more than museum because you have to create the revolution for the Palestinian culture inside Israel. For that, I say that it's not only more than the questions here, because we have to connect with the people, that the 60% of the people there are very poor, and we have to connect them to attract them to come to the museum. But in the same level, we have to continue contact with the high level inside Israel and outside Israel, to keep the museum to be very professional, and at the same time to keep it to be part of the very low level inside al-Fahim. It's for that I say that a lot of things, a lot of questions inside the first Arab museum, but and every day we discover another needs that we didn't know before, and for that I say that the curator have to be more than a curator. The museum have to be the vision for all the Palestinian community inside Israel and outside Israel.
Maybe one small thing about the political role, the social role of museums, is that I think we're discussing different types of political questions or different types of politics. There is this immediate response to something that's going on in I'd say, local politics or even state politics, sometimes even international politics. And I think the tempo of what's going on in the media does not work well with the tempo that I think museums should take into account. We are, I think by definition, we need to stretch time back rather than conform and respond to this growing tempo of what's going on in the media. And there is this side to that in which we are actually being manipulated. I mean, you mentioned this loyalty in culture law, whatever it's called. I think it's one big manipulation, and I think our response to that needs to take that manipulation into account. So we're actually going into a game which I'm not sure we want to play. I know that I don't want to play that game, on the one hand. On the other hand, if we don't respond to that, we are actually responding in a way. So we need to balance these issues. That's a very, I'd say, superficial type of political question. The deeper side, I think, has to do with longer-term processes that happen in society, and there I think we have a very important role of being a safe place, of opening up for debate or for discussion, of engaging people, of engaging people with art, of asking these very complicated questions that you refer to about what is the right way, or is there a way to, or are there different ways to engage different communities, different parts of society with different facets of culture? Because there's different types of cultures, then there's different ways to engage with that. And once you look at different cultures, how they come into that, it becomes a very complex question. And I think there we have a very strong role, but it's not a one-liner. It's actually this question of how we invite different people into the museum, how we retain the different voices or the different ways of discussing these things. And in this type of discussion becomes a very general sort of issue. Maybe we need to go deeper into an example, into a specific, to make it more interesting or more spicy.
Well, actually, if I can follow up on this, actually, I think, again, I completely agree that there are different ways in which museums do politics. So I'll give an example from the Israel Museum. At the end of the archaeological exhibit, when you see the late antique Jewish and Christian, basically objects of ritual and so on that look exactly the same and actually are very similar and sometimes hard to distinguish, I think that's a very powerful political statement, and one that actually takes a stand. So in a sense, and in a way, as Sido says, much more fundamental than actually taking a stand on a particular controversy of the moment. And I think that was actually a fantastically brilliant choice, to make a stand just by putting objects next to each other.
No, I agree with you that sometimes maybe taking a general stand or a very far away stand is also political, but we're living in a specific moment in Israel, and if we think about the law of loyalty in culture, for example, if you talk about, I don't know, I talk with my Palestinian friends from Haifa, this is a reality, you know. They don't have to wait until the law passes before people cancel their events. So the censorship is already happening, even if the law did not pass. So the question is, in this extreme moment or situation, is it, I don't know, I don't have an answer, but I have my answer, I don't know, but is it enough, you know? And are the museums or the art institutions or cultural institutions have the power to do something or to resist? And are they're supposed to be places of resistance? So it's an open question. I agree that not in every question that the media is talking, we have to follow up on the temper of the media, or I don't know. But sometimes we reach a moment that you need to do something, and I wonder if the moment has arrived, and if so, if the museums are the place to do that.
We will build barricades.
Well, actually, the answer is quite simple. What museums do is they collect artworks or artifacts or objects, and they display them. And that is the place where we need to do our statements. We need to do exhibitions. We need to bring people to discuss these exhibitions. We need to bring different people to interpret these exhibitions in different ways. We need to have internal discussions about what we want and don't want to collect. That is the work. Mm-hmm. That is what we need to do. The side that discusses these things out in the public, the words, that layer of discussion is sometimes detrimental to that. Mm-hmm. And so I think the example that you brought up with an exhibition exposing Iranian culture from an Iranian viewpoint, that is in the heart of what museums need to do, even if it's controversial or at that point in time very controversial, it still needs to be done. That's simple. I think, but you're referring to questions of actually responding to things which are not really in the museum realm. They're a little bit outside of the museum realm, and that's a different question.
This is why, for example, I gave the MoMA example, because you can respond through the museum realm, not just by being a platform for, I don't know, inviting dialogue, but through an exhibition. This is why I asked earlier if it's enough that a museum opens up different views, or it can take a stand. And it can take a stand through actions like the one loaning work to Iran, or hanging works of artists that cannot enter the US in the MoMA, or doing something here. So this is the question: is the museum, or does the museum have a way to resist through its function, to do something through exhibitions, through art events, becoming a new public sphere, but through its original purposes?
Well, I think that not only museums, I mean everyone should think of new practices, and well, I feel that I was just talking a little bit before the start of the talk about working, for example, outside the museum wall, like working with the idea of the place in Haifa, for example, and the museum should work as a place that deal with use its network and the infrastructure, and even its collections, to step outside the walls of the museums to different locations, and to evoke or to inspire alternative narrations of the place. I find that working with the place is a very good practice, because it bypasses these not debates but controversies that by their nature they lead to radicalism, and it became insane everywhere. But if you work with the idea of the place in the larger sense, Leer, I mean the place that everybody, I mean you live there, and these are life together, and it invokes emotions and memories and forces of solidarity, and I sensed it in Haifa in July when we made this big event, Pyramida Platform, and there were thousands and thousands of people from different communities walking in the city and visiting different places. But the museum should use what the museum is capable of, and deal with the common, with the space that belongs to people. And actually, as you said about the object, you were describing why the museum used the real object. You said that the text or description, it was in another lecture that I heard in the YouTube, that when you describe an object, you always have a certain viewpoint, or when you make an illustration. But when you use the real object, the physical object, it is always more than that what you can say about it in a certain time. And it's the same with the space, with the place. And the place is always more than you can say about it. And people always, it's in their family albums, it's in their memory. And I think this is a great way. So it's just an example that we should deal with new tactics, new ways of dealing with situations that becomes really, we play a game, and we cannot take the role that the Ministry of Culture is giving us to be the one that actually puts the red flag so that others will burn it.
So maybe a more simple question. I don't know. Is it? I think maybe all of us are working in institutions that are either national or at least supported by the state. And I ask a question: why, if it's better or more effective to do something in this kind of institutions than to be a real alternative, like to work in a place that you don't have to limit yourself. Like some of the examples here said that you're funded and you have some limitations. So what's the differences are, and why to work or why to try to do something from inside the institution or the funded institution in a way. It's more complicated because we talked about it earlier that, for example, when you think about the Israel Museum, so I think most of its fundings are not from the state, but at the same time, for the wide public, you see the title, the Israel Museum, and they have all these collections and the archaeology, and it's really next to the parliament, so it has this, I don't know, atmosphere, but of a national museum or something that represents the state. But I asked a question about what it means to say something from the Israel Museum, or from in Harod, or from a small, or from the British Museum, or from a small gallery in South London, or south of Tel Aviv.
Or a large gallery in Fachem.
But which is also funded, so it also has.
I'm not sure I understand the question. The question is what is the meaning of the title or the source of the declaration or the source of an exhibition?
No, the first question, if you can do something that is more, you feel effective or important or has more influence from inside the institution, even though there are limitations, except for being in a more central place, what are the advantages of working from inside an institution? Or like if you loan a work of art for Iran from the British Museum, it's different than from a private collection. If you do something in the Israel Museum under its title, it's different than doing it in a private gallery in Tel Aviv. If you do something in Fachem,
or in Barbour Gallery.
Or in Barbour Gallery, yeah. So. Okay.
What is the difference? That's the question.
No, I just wanted to know if there are advantages. What?
Well, there's a basic advantage is that if you have a wide exposure and if you're under a public scrutiny, it means that potentially you have more of an effect. Okay? Then, of course, you have to decide what you do, but you also have to decide who are you corresponding with. And if you believe that you want to have a wide effect and you actually want to reach all parts of society, any stand that you take will, especially in a high tension society like the Israeli society, but I think in all societies, you have the chance of also taking people out of the discussion or putting up a sign saying you cannot enter here. This is not your discussion, or you have no place here. So it's a very tricky issue. This is why I feel that museums basically of course they have a very important social role. They should also do outreach in the sense that Galia is mentioning. I mean, they have to work outside the walls of the museum in many ways, and I think most museums do that, maybe not to the same extent. They also bring in people not only for the classical role of museums, which is walking through galleries and looking at artifacts, but also for a wide array of educational programs of different types. But going back to that, I would say that you have to be both, or I'd say it in a totally different way. The fact that you are inviting everybody into the museum and that inside the museum you exercise a very open-minded view and you put things together which are very provocative sometimes, that in itself is a very strong political statement. Okay, especially in the way things look now, not only here but also in the United States and in some parts of Europe. So, if we go to the Israel Museum, the entrance gallery to the Israeli art permanent exhibition or permanent collection, what is hung there on the wall, actually some of the people responsible for that are sitting here in the audience, is in itself a very, very strong declaration about what Israeli art is. And it is open for discussion for whoever wants to actually do that move, which is coming to the museum. And I think it's a different question. It didn't come up here today, but it has to do with the question of whether you're going out and reaching out or you're bringing people in. Museums have or should have a very, something very special about being inside them, which is different than looking at them from the outside. This is what I believe. Something about their site, which has to do with what you call the place, okay, where they are situated physically, geographically. Their architecture has a lot to do with that. And if we look at different architectures of different museums in the world, we can see that actually the architecture in itself is a political statement in many cases. The way they invite people in, it's not only the cost of the ticket, it's a whole array of things of the way you invite people in. And then once they are in, what is the atmosphere, or what sort of experience are you creating for the people coming in from the different places they're coming in from? And some people feel more comfortable, and some people feel less comfortable. And there's actually, the way I see it, it's more important to deal with that than with your declarations that go out to the media or wherever they go. That is the real role, because I think we have the opportunity as museums to work with this very long-term, slow, tedious thing we call education. Okay, which takes a long time, which needs to, requires us to be very thoughtful, which does not happen overnight.
אז רבותיי, אני מדבר על המוסד שלי כמוסד ממומן, מצד שני הוא מוסד ציבורי. כמוסד ציבורי יש לי לויאליות לקהילה ולקהל שמנו מגיע. והקהל שמנו מגיע הוא רוצה ייצוג נכון לתרבות, לנרטיב הפלסטיני, לזיכרון ולעתיד. וכמוסד ממומן אני צריך להיות לויאלי למערכת הפוליטית, שכל הזמן מפציצה אותי בלא ולא ולא, ולא מה מותר אלא מה אסור כל הזמן. ולכן כשאני רוצה להתעסק עם הנרטיב שלי כחלק מהתרבות שלי, היא בספק אם היא עונה על החוק האוסר עליי עיסוק בזה, או שהיא על הגבול למעשה. וכשאני רוצה להציף דברים למעלה, האם זה מאפשר לי להציף בעיות של כאב ושל תרבות, ולשתף בה את האחרים, כדי שיוכלו גם אחרים והצופים האחרים לא ישיר מבט לתרבות שמנה מגיע, או שאני צריך להיות לויאלי למערכת כדי להמשיך לקבל תקציב, והתקציב הזה לא ייפסק. ולכן אני על הסף, אני לא על הסף, אני על קו התפר בין להיות חופשי לדבר לבין לא להיות חופשי כדי לא להיות מוקצה ממחמת המיאוס. ולכן אני בקטע בתפר בין תרבות פלסטינית שצריכה להיות גשר לתרבות הבינלאומית, והיא צריכה לעשות בצורה כנה, ישירה ואמיתית. ביום שנפסיק להתייחס אליה בצורה כנה וישירה ואמיתית ולהציג אותה באופן נכון, גם הלגיטימציה שלי כאדם שמנסה לייצר שינוי בתרבות היא נשמטת מתחת לרגליים שלי. זאת אומרת, המורכבות שבה אני כמנהל גלריה ומי שמנסה לייצר מוזיאון עתידי, המורכבות שלי היא הרבה יותר קשה מכל דבר אחר. והלוואי, והלוואי, אם הייתי היום מתעסק עם השאלות שמתנהל הדיון לגביהם היום. כי השאלות שלנו הרבה יותר עמוקות מכך. הן תקציביות, הן מודעות, הן האם אתה מתעסק עם המורשת, או שאתה מתעסק עם העבר, או שאתה מקשר את העבר לעתיד. איך אתה עושה את כל המורכבויות האלה? ולכן אני פשוט כאן, כשאני החלטתי לבוא לפה, למרות שהשפה המדוברת כאן היא אנגלית, וידעתי שהעברית שלי תהיה באוכריי, מה שנקרא, ותעצור מן להבין את הכל, אבל רציתי להביא את הניסיון שלי לכאן, כדי לספר גם על קושי, וגם על אתגרים בעתיד, והם לא קלים, האתגרים לא קלים, אבל הקשיים הם לא מעטים.
For our English speaker audience, I think the main points are, Said already wrote them, so you can read what he said. And maybe before opening these discussions to the audience, I'll go back to the title and ask.
I wanted to say one thing, actually, not about what Said just said, which was very powerful, but about the things that were said just before about institutions and effect or impact in place, maybe in a slightly different way, because museums don't actually exist in a vacuum, right? And say in a city like Jerusalem, right, there are other cultural institutions in this city, the National Library, there's an art academy, as you know, a music academy, the university, and they all can serve as part, if we want to make an impact, if we have to have influence, we want to connect those. And rather than work as fragmented, right, so you have each institution sends a message, the messages can be quite similar, but they each work in a different way. Now, each one of those institutions has a different medium and a different form of discourse and a different type of audience they can reach. But I think if we do collaborate and actually coordinate the messages that we want to pass along, right, the whole will be greater than the sum of its parts. And so I do think that this is one way in which we can magnify the impact of the cultural network writ large in this kind of way.
I agree.
There we go, and she agrees.
You can agree with that. Yeah.
Okay.
No,
So
that's also the meaning of working with the place. I mean, the network of institution and connecting what really comes from downwards. I mean, what the academic institutions and all those institutions with people working on the spot and alternative places, and all these networks should work together. This is one of the things that we have to learn to do, because that's really empowering civil, whatever was said here. This is empowering our ability to function in times of crisis like that. So, please.
I just one remark regarding funding and the problems of funding in museums. I don't pretend to even understand Said's problems in al-Fahim. I can only sort of appreciate them from the outside, and I don't envy him in any way. But I want to clarify that any structure of funding is political and has consequences. So if you raise the question of the Israel Museum is roughly a little bit under 15% of its funding comes from the state, both from the government and the local government. Approximately 30%, maybe a little less, comes from self-income, which is ticketing and events, and about 55% comes from donors. Donors have agendas. They have issues. They have drives. They have donors are sometimes collectors. Sometimes they have connections with galleries. They connect to this whole big realm of the political art world. Okay, if we're dealing with art, donors for our archaeology wing have their own agendas. Some of them are from that side and some from this side. If you look at the public and you say, okay, let's go to the public. Let's get everybody to fund us so we are less controlled by the donors, for example, you go into the realm of rating, right? You need to be very popular or populistic. So that's another agenda, another cost, and so on and so forth. So really, the best solution is probably, as always, diversity. Okay, if you can build a very diverse structure of funding, it means that each member of this structure has less power over you, and you are relatively more free to make your decisions. What you're suggesting in terms of collaboration, which is an idea, I don't know how it can be actually practiced, is that and rather than being separate institutions, separate organizations with a loose control or some loose sort of affinity, it becomes a stronger connection and mutual support system, both between the organization institutions and with, I would say, other entities in society. It's a very beautiful idea, but the practicality of it, I think, is very, very complicated.
Yeah, but I mean, is stepping out of the walls of the museum and being interested in what is going on outside. I mean, outside, I don't mean politics. I mean outside. And I don't even mean, I mean in Jerusalem, it means so many things, and some of them quite horrible. But I mean that simple thing, working with other people that are working in the same town and creating some sort of a network that is a network of solidarity, of people working, and then also connecting to, let's say, Hadass with Barbour, with what is happening there. I mean, without manifesting too much, but the fact that you work together and sometimes you initiate things together, this is a stand. This is a political stand also.
עוד פעם בעברית ולתרגם. גם כאן, לנו כמוסד נתמך, יש לנו כאן כמובן מורכבות פשוט שאפשר להסביר אותה בכמה כיוונים. למשל, כשאני החלטתי לבנות את המוזיאון, החלטתי ש50-60% מהתקציב של המוזיאון יבוא מערבים. אם לא יבוא מערבים, אני לא אבנה את המוזיאון. היום אני מוכן להתפשר על 20%. מה לעשות? ולמה? כי אני היום מסתובב בכל העולם, וה-BDS נגד ישראל תופס אותנו בפנים. כי אנחנו מוסד בתוך ישראל. אז כשאני הולך לשם ונותן להם קטלוג יפה על ההיסטוריה של אום אל-פחם ואדי ערה, שמדבר על הנרטיב הפלסטיני, אם לא קוראים מה שיש בפנים, שואלים אותי למה יש בעברית. למה יש עברית בתוך הקטלוג? ואחר כך אני רוצה אותם בתוך הבורד שלנו בארצות הברית, כדי שיסייעו לנו להקים מוזיאון, השואלים אם יש יהודים שם. זאת אומרת, אני מצד אחד מוקצה מחמת המיאוס, כי אני לא כאן ולא שם, ואני בתוך מדינת ישראל נחשב כפלסטיני. ואצל הערבים מחוץ למדינת ישראל, אני נחשב כעוכר ערבים ואני נמצא בתוך מדינת ישראל. ולכן אני גם לא אשכח יום אחד, שיום אחד אני מציג תערוכה על הכיבוש בתוך הגלריה, ועל המחסומים. באחד המחסומים, ואחת העבודות הייתה עבודת וידאו ארט, שהיא הציגה ילדים בוכים יחד עם האמהות שלהם, במחסום שלא נפסק, כל הזמן בכי ובכי ובכי. ובאותו יום מגיע אליי תורם משוויץ, יהודי, חבר טוב שלי, והיא שואלת אותי למה אני צריך לממן גלריה שמציגה את מדינת ישראל ברע. ואז אני בהלם. אתה נותן כסף ואתה מכתיב לי גם את התכנים של המוזיאון. זאת אומרת, אני הרגשתי פגיעה קשה ביותר. כאילו, הוא רוצה לקנות אותי, לקנות את האמירה שלי בכסף שלו. ובאופן אוטומטי אמרתי לו, אתה רשאי לעשות עוד פעולה. ושאל אותי מה היא. אמרתי לו, תפסיק לתרום ותפסיק להגיע למקום הזה. זאת אומרת, אני גם מצד אחד רוצה לייצר את הגאווה שלי, כי רק בגאווה אני יכול להשאיר מבט לאחר. ומצד שני, מנסים גם לחבות אותה ולהשאיר אותה מוחבאת שם, כי אם זה גאווה אז היא מאיימת. זאת אומרת, איפה אני בקטע הזה? עכשיו, מצד שני, אני גם לא אעריך פה, כדי פשוט אנחנו ב-48 הנכבה ריסקה את התרבות הפלסטינית. לא נותר ממנה כלום. האם עליי להחיות אותה? האם עליי מוטלת האחריות בהבניית הזיכרון והנרטיב הפלסטיני היכן שאני נמצא כאן? האם זו החובה שלי? או שהחובה שלי להתעסק אומנות עכשווית בלבד, להתרחק מכל משהו קשור לנרטיב האחר?
So I'll shortly translate and then try to go back from the local discussion to something, to the original question that we started with, but I'll translate at least partly what Said said. He started by saying that when he established the museum, he wanted to have at least 60% of the funding by Arab supporters, and today, even if he'll have 20%, he'll be satisfied. And part of it is, or most of it is because of the BDS, that even though it's a Palestinian museum, when he goes abroad to raise fundings, he's considered part of Israel, and it's difficult to raise money under the BDS when, for example, people can ask him why there's Hebrew texts in his catalogs, or why there are Jewish people involved in the museum. He gave also an example of an exhibition he showed with a checkpoint where there was a crying child in the video, and one of a Jewish supporter from Switzerland, a friend that supported the museum in the past, asked him why should he support the museum when it shows Israel in bad manners outside. The last thing that he said maybe is about the 1948 Nakba, which ruined Palestinian culture, and what can you do from there? Like, how can he I don't know, keep his pride, and at the same time, when this pride is giving problems, when you try to raise money or to find support or to work in the museum or tell the story. So after this discussion, I want to go back for a moment to the first question that we started with, and then to open it up to questions from the audience. The title of this panel is the civic role of curators. In the short text that is accompanied to the title, they offer curators as mediators, interpreters, translators, and if we talk about more generally about vita activa and vita contemplativa, I maybe want to offer also storytellers in the division between storytellers and actors. And I wanted to ask the participants here, what is the role of the curator, or how do you understand it? The civic role or the role at all? So.
I think the role of the curator is to present, to try to, first of all, you start with keeping the object safe. That's quite clear. That's the first one. Even if that means not allowing it to be seen very often, that has to be the first thing. It's got to survive, and that's already a conflict. How public can it be? And one's got to be very clear about that. Then you have to make it accessible as widely as possible. That means now digitally, I think without question. And absolute priority to have a collection digitally accessible. And then you have to try to tell the story of the object. And this is, I think, a very difficult bit. This is something I find very particular in areas where you're talking obviously about other cultures. Whose story am I allowed to tell? Am I allowed to try to tell somebody else's story? We all know, we've all worked on other people's cultures, we've all studied them, and we all know how important it is. And we've all been taught by people talking about their own, but also about other cultures. It's becoming, as you know, a very dangerous area. And how the curator can speak for the object without presuming to speak for the people behind the object is a very, very difficult question. And I think just to propose one problem that is perhaps a particular one, and perhaps particularly relevant in the fascinating discussion that we just had from Said, in what sense to make the collection available. If you're dealing with Aboriginal Australian material, which has been out of Australia for over 100 years, there's no question of it being asked for return, but the community today says, we don't want women to see that object. That is not allowed in our tradition. What is the curator's role? How does the curator decide that? You can all see the conflict. You can all see there is no answer. It's essential, if we're going to understand those objects, and if those objects are going to continue to play a part in the life of the world, that the world understands how you can think experience and existence differently through those objects. But also we have to continue working with the community and respect them. The Enlightenment position was, of course, absolutely clear that we don't acknowledge any religious objections to our pursuit of knowledge. That's because Enlightenment was essentially dealing simply with the Catholic Church and the Protestant Church, and it could disregard them. We can't do that now. I think this is a very, very complex question and a very difficult moral one. Are we allowed to show other people's objects that came long ago from another culture, in a way that the culture that those people today, or the descendants of those people today, declare to be unacceptable? And we often can't know whether 100 years ago that would have been the same view. It's a major problem for all museums trying to show that kind of material, and it's becoming stronger and stronger. I think I find it a very difficult conflict.
Maybe just relating to that. First of all, what would happen if a group of women from that culture comes up and says, you know, that was actually an expression of patriarchal dominance in our culture, and we actually oppose to that, and we think women from our culture should see those objects. So, and you can continue layering that. The second thing is, I think that the choice of actually creating a museum and showing things in a museum already has that embedded in it, because a curator, if we look at artistic objects, if we look at very old objects and from a different culture, there's always this idea of actually our curiosity and our wonder at other different exotic cultures. We're interested in the world, we're curious, we want to see things which we have not seen yet. That is always the case in museums, I think. The second thing is that any act of curating always has that in it. The curator is not the artist. The artist says something. Whether it's a solo show or a group show, there are different ideas, different voices. The curator always interprets that in their or her particular way, and it's always slightly different or very much different than the way the artist sees it. Then if you go to the meta level and look at the museum now has a program of exhibitions, and they interact as well. So you have these echoes of different exhibitions interacting, and so on and so forth. So it's actually this idea of somebody telling somebody else's story is embedded in culture, okay? Anybody who writes a book does that. So I think it has a philosophical part, but it has a very practical part as well.
Galia? Yeah.
I think we can say that the Neil MacGregor wave has won. I'm speaking specifically about objects. Material culture is the rage now, at least in the humanities, where I walk around. This seems to be the next big thing. And objects are taken just in the way that you've shown us yesterday, again, to be holding the key to understanding culture, history, differences, etc. But unlike, say, visual art, that has a whole discipline and tradition of how to interpret it, it's very difficult to interpret objects. That's what I was trying to say before. It didn't come out well, so I'm trying again. There is no established discipline to do this. I'm actually now writing a book about an object, and it's very difficult. And it's quite experimental in what it does. So I think this gives us an opportunity for the for the curators to deal with objects, because there's exciting new trend, there's a lot of interest, and there is no established experience, methodology, theory. There's bits and pieces called think theory. They're not yet serious enough that actually offer a new space. And that's a space where I think curators have a huge role. Curators know much more about these things than academics pretty much ever do. So this is something that I think, and again, this goes back to what I learned from what you were saying yesterday, that space for interpreting objects is also a space for developing those different narratives and thinking about them and leaving questions open. And I do think that field it's not a field, it's a whole void that is underdeveloped, and that's where I think curators that deal with objects should be focusing their attention.
Well, I would just add that it is never about objects only, because curating is installing objects and creating networks. So it is always about relationship. And what counts here is relationship. And this is the most ancient way of people to develop the ideas or create private and collective memory. I mean, since the caves, since prehistoric time, you install objects in a space, in a specific space, and that's how you can deal with things that you cannot touch, and these are our thinking and our memory. And so, yeah, it is about relationship. And as I said before, my emphasis now is more, I mean, there is one way, the object, and the other way is also dealing with the specific space and the relationship. And so as a curator now, I'm more interested in creating that in the larger specific space, which is the place, and then responding to you, also moving collections to different locations, because the space would load the same collection in a different way that you will never be able to articulate in text, because the space has a very, very strong force for people, especially people of this place.
מאחר ואני מייחס חשיבות גדולה לתפקידו של האוצר בנסיבות ובמציאות המורכבת שאני הזכרתי אותה קודם, אז אני כתבתי כאן כמה תפקידים לאוצר. זה לא רק אוצר שהוא מתווך ובין היצירה והאמן לצופה, אלא הרבה מעבר לכך. ואני כתבתי כמה דברים כאן ואני אקריא אותם. כאילו על האוצר להיות דמות מובילה ושעיקר עבודתה תהיה בהענקת תשומת לב מיוחדת לקהל המקומי ולמציאות התרבותית המשתנה. לאוצר יהיה תפקיד מכריע בעיצוב דרכו של המוזיאון העתידי, בעיצומה של התרבות הפלסטינית והבנייתו של הזיכרון הפלסטיני. על כן על האוצר במוזיאון החדש להיות בעל ידע נרחב בתרבות המקומית והבינלאומית, בעל יכולת לחבר את העבר עם ההווה ולהתמודד עם תחושות הפליטות והתקווה כאחד. חשיבותו היא בכך שהוא החוליה המרכזית המחברת בין ההתנסות האישית שלו לבין היצירה של האמן המוצג ובין הצופה. על האוצר במציאות הפלסטינית המתפתחת תרבותית להיות מתווך ולדעת להציע רעיונות חדשים ונגישים ושניתנים ליישום. על האוצר במציאות הזו להיות גם יוצר, מאחר וחלק גדול מהחלל החדש במוזיאון שיבנה או בגלריה הקיימת והזמנית יהיה שייך לו, בתפקידו לא יסתיים בכתיבת טקסט או בעריכת התצוגה אלא הרבה מעבר לכך. עליו להיות המתווך הישיר בין העבר וההווה, בין הלוקלי והאוניברסלי, בין המופשט לקונקרטי, ומעל לכל להיות קשוב לקהילה המקומית, אך יחד עם זאת להיות עם חזון ותעוזה כדי לבוא עם רעיונות חדשים באשר בכוחם לערער על הקיים ולשנות סדרי עולם. זה פשוט חשוב מאוד, כי אנשים, האוצר מגיע לחברה מאוד דתית, מאוד מסורתית, אם לא יעיז לעשות דברים, הדברים יישארו מקובעים כל הזמן. הוא גם צריך לדעת להעיז, אבל הוא גם צריך לדעת איך לעשות את זה כדי לא לעורר את כולם נגדו, ובסוף גם זה לא יהיה. צריך לעשות את זה בצורה מאוד רגישה ובצורה מאוד חכמה. כוחו של האוצר הוא בכך שהוא נמצא בעמדת כוח עצומה, והעבודה שלו מאפשרת לו לשלוט במרחב החזותי ולקבוע את התנהלותו של המקום. אני לא אקריא עד הסוף, אבל אני אקריא את המשפט האחרון שכתבתי אותו. על האוצר במוזיאון הפלסטיני להיות משוטט אחר מקורות השראה, חומרים רבים ונסתרים, דימויים ורעיונות וכל מידע אודות התפתחותה של האומנות הפלסטינית העכשווית בארץ ובעולם, במטרה להפגיש את כל החומרים האלה אל תוך תיקייה אישית אחת שלו, שתאפשר בנייה של נרטיב אשר ישקף את הנרטיב הקולקטיבי של האוכלוסייה הפלסטינית בכל מקום.
So translate. Yes, so okay. So I won't waste the time. It's I think the last page that Said wrote, the last two pages you can read, and if anyone has questions afterwards, I can translate separately. We have just a few more minutes, so if there are any...
So Can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
So the first question is for Mr.
Do you want to maybe say who you are, or for the discussion?
I'm Hadass. The first question is for Mr. MacGregor. Regarding the role of the curator, what do you feel about the idea of curator, and the tour last Saturday that activists made from around the world that dealt in the British Museum, that dealt with the return of cultural objects acquired through colonialism? That's my first question. Should I continue
Maybe
to the
we
second
can start
Okay.
the answer.
Sorry, the question of where objects belong depends clearly is a fundamental one, and I would only say very briefly about the question of restitution claims. That first of all, I think you need to recognize the history of every object is going to be different. And you need to do, so provenance research is absolutely essential. If we're talking about that's a key part. Then the question of where is this object going to do most good and to whom is a key question. And who has the right to assert that? And the basis of who has the right to claim any object made a century ago, 2 centuries ago, and on what basis? If we're not in the realms of private family possessions, on what basis is this claim being made? I don't have an answer to this, but I think the questions are very complex. And I think I would argue that the real challenge for objects from all cultures, 2 questions. Do you want to see in one place objects from all over the world or not? Is that useful? Is it useful to have a place where you can look at, have a conspectus of humanity? If you think that's useful, then those questions have got to be addressed, and somehow they've got to be got together. But then secondly is, can you see those great collections then as lending libraries? Because the question, to my mind, is not just should European art be seen in Europe or should African art go back to Africa? The question is, how are the Chinese going to find out about African art, and so on? And those are questions that are the responsibilities of trustees who hold these collections for everybody. So I mean, I don't have the answer. It's a key question, but I think it's very easy to say everything acquired in a colonial period is wrongly acquired and must be returned. To whom? Most of the owners, well, obviously none of them is alive, but most of them were not owned individually in a European legal system, under what legal system, to which heirs or whatever, or to a modern state which didn't exist at that point. They are very, very complex questions. And I think but I think the key question is, where will the objects do most good for most people?
And who do you think has to address that question?
Everybody. Everybody. It is a fundamental question for academic debate, I think. I mean, the universities above all, because there are so many different disciplines of law, sociology, human rights, all the rest of it. And it's also very important to sort out truth from falsehood in the allegations. So I think it's a major question. I agree.
And my second question is regarding the idea of the museum as taking stands that you were talking about, Avi. What do you think about a fair representation of women? And in this context, what do you think about the representation of women without, of course, my honor to Galia, but what do you think about this panel and the representation of women?
I'm only a mediator. I'm not answering a question.
This is a question to everyone, not to you.
No, I'm kidding. I have to say, I think that representation of women is very important. I have to say that in my gallery, if you look at the program for the coming year, there are a lot of female artists that are having solo and group shows. I think that it's impossible to think about every specific panel or exhibition and to count specifically only male and female, because we have a lot of things to count. For example, how many, if we talk about Israel, Ashkenazi and Mizrahi people, you know, how many, there are a lot of different questions of counting. I think that you have to answer this question if you look about a longer program. For example, if you, I'm not part of the Van Leer Institute, but I have to say that, for example, if you look about their entire program for the year, and then you'll ask yourself, are there enough female speakers? Maybe not. I don't know. Shai can answer. I'm kidding.
But only if this is the last. So I'd like to conclude. So maybe
yeah. So I'll just say that I think that you have to look at it globally and to think about an institution and like for a longer term of program and to ask this question. רגע, סעיד רוצה להגיד משהו?
לגבי נשים, אז אני גם אגיד משהו. יש לנו בגלריה בעיה מאוד גדולה בייצוג נשי, ואני אתן דוגמה קטנה. אנחנו הקמנו גוף שנקרא אמני הוואדי, ליווינו אותם שנה שלמה. עכשיו הגיע הזמן לעשות להם תערוכה. התערוכה נקראת 12 פלוס 1. למה? 12 נשים וגבר אחד. אז יש לנו בעיה גדולה עם נשים, לייצג נשים, כי הם כולם נשים היום. כמעט רוב האוכלוסייה היוצרת בתוך האוכלוסייה הערבית היא אוכלוסייה נשית, וזה מפר את האיזון שהיה קיים כל הזמן.
Okay, so
תקנת, וזה טוב, ומבורך אגב, זה מבורך מאוד.
So first of all, Avi, on your behalf, I'd like to thank the participants of the panel and thank also Avi. I'd also, and especially Neil MacGregor, our guest. I feel, Hadass, thank you. And I think you're absolutely right that the composition, even of this panel, I think Avi's right that we need to look at things in an integrated way, but I also think that this kind of criticism is important, and we will bear this in mind. I think that if we move from this panel to the larger scheme of things, thank you very much everyone for being here.